Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. In the hills of Appalachia, stories cling to the earth like mist. Some you hear around campfires, softened by time and retelling. Others are whispered only when the wind is howling through the hollows because speaking them aloud feels dangerous, like calling something back from the dead. This is one of those stories. It begins with a girl whose name the county tried to erase, a girl born into a family where bloodlines folded in on themselves for generations, until her very existence became a living testament to something both unnatural and inevitable. She was 16 when the whispers began. They said she was with child. At first, no one outside the family paid much mind. Girls got pregnant young in these mountains, and it wasn't uncommon for the father to disappear into the coal mines or run off before the baby came. But the details didn't add up. The girl had never been seen with a boyfriend. She didn't attend the small schoolhouse dances. She was rarely allowed beyond the sagging fence line of her family's cabin. And yet, her belly grew. An old neighbor, long since dead, swore she saw the truth one late autumn night. A flicker of lamplight in the cabin window. Two figures moving together, too close for comfort. The girl's brother, barely older than she was, slipped into her room. The next morning, the house was quiet as a grave. The family was known for keeping to themselves, the kind of people who'd sooner aim a shotgun at you than answer a question, and yet every so often, something slipped out. A cousin found wandering barefoot in winter, muttering about sins the Lord can't forgive. A mother who vanished for weeks, returning with a bruise, a face and a stare that never quite met your eyes. And now, the girl, pregnant, her brother, the only possible father. This is where the paper trail ends and the oral history begins, and if you're willing to follow me deeper, I'll tell you how far this family's roots really went and why no one in town dared to dig them up. The family's name was never printed in the local paper, not once. Even when births and deaths were listed in the back pages, theirs were conspicuously absent. It was as if they were ghosts, living in the same county as everyone else, but outside the laws and customs that governed ordinary life. People said their land was cursed, but it was no curse. It was isolation, a deliberate sealing off of the bloodline from outsiders. And that kind of isolation, it changes people. It was the brother who first began showing signs of what the older folks in town called mountain madness. By 12, his shoulders were already broad, but his eyes never quite lined up when he looked at you. He spoke in slow, deliberate tones, as if words had to travel farther for him than they did for other boys. His father kept him close, always at the cabin, never at school longer than a few days at a time. When the county truant officer came knocking, he was told the boy was needed at home to help with the woodpile, the livestock, the chores. And the officer left it at that. No one wanted trouble with the family. The girl, quiet, frail, with a pale face that seemed to have forgotten how to smile, spent her days sewing and cooking beside her mother. She was pretty in a delicate way, but there was something in her expression that unsettled people, like she knew something she could never say. Some thought she was simple-minded, others suspected she was just afraid. Either way, she didn't speak much when strangers were near. It's important to understand something about these mountains. Privacy isn't just a right here, it's a religion, and that religion can protect terrible things. No one asked why the brother and sister were always together. No one questioned the way he hovered around her, his hand gripping her shoulder in a way that wasn't quite protective, but wasn't quite right either. By the time her belly began to swell, the family's strategy was simple: keep her hidden. She no longer fetched water from the creek. She no longer stood on the porch at sunset. The girl was disappearing into the walls of her own home, and the town was content to let it happen. But there was one problem. In a place this small, nothing stays hidden forever, and when the truth slipped out, it would spread faster than fire in dry grass. It started with a midwife, an old woman who had delivered more babies than she could count, some in homes without electricity, others in shacks barely holding together against the wind. She knew the sound of childbirth, its cries, its rhythms, its timing, and one cold February night, she heard it coming from the cabin on the ridge. The family hadn't sent for her. In fact, they hadn't sent for anyone. But the midwife knew. She knew because she'd heard it all before, in other hidden corners of these mountains where shame and desperation breed their own kind of silence. She arrived at the door without knocking, just as the girl's moans grew sharper. Inside, the air was thick with kerosene and sweat. The mother glared at her, but didn't turn her away. The father sat in the corner, carving a stick with his pocket knife, eyes fixed anywhere but the bed. And the brother was nowhere in sight. The birth was not easy. The girl's body was too small, too young to bear the weight of what it carried. She bled more than she should have. The midwife worked in silence, her hands moving with grim precision, her eyes occasionally darting toward the closed door, as if expecting someone to burst in. When the child finally came, the midwife did not smile. She wrapped the baby in a thin, frayed blanket and handed it to the mother. The father still wouldn't look. It was then, in that dim light, that the midwife saw it. A certain cast to the child's features, subtle but undeniable, the shape of the eyes, the curve of the jaw. It was not the face of a healthy stranger's child. It was the face of family. Too much family. She had seen it before in other babies born of cousins, and sometimes worse. And she knew, without being told, that the brother was the father. The girl lay still, staring at the ceiling as if her spirit had already left her. The midwife wanted to speak, to name the sin aloud, but in these hills, the law of blood runs deeper than the law of man. She kept her silence. When she left, the father followed her to the edge of the yard. He didn't threaten her, he didn't have to. The message was clear. This never happened. The midwife never went back to that cabin, but word has a way of traveling, even when no one speaks it. And soon, the whispers were louder than the wind in the holler. The whispers spread quietly at first, just a few older women at the general store, murmuring in low voices while pretending to examine bolts of cloth, then a farmer passing along the ridge who claimed he'd seen the brother carrying the infant in his arms one morning, his face unreadable in the fog. In a town this small, even a single raised eyebrow can become a storm, and within weeks the story was everywhere. Except in the open. The preacher heard it next. He'd been in these mountains long enough to know the difference between gossip and warning. One night, after a service that the family had, predictably, not attended, an elder leaned in close and told him that the girl's child wasn't right. The preacher didn't ask what that meant. He had seen enough malformed babies in his youth to know the look people meant. But the part that made his blood run cold was what came next. The elder said plainly, "That boy's the daddy, the one they call her brother." And then he walked away, leaving the preacher standing alone in the lamplight. In another place, such a claim would have set the law in motion. But here, the law was just another outsider, one who didn't belong in family matters. The sheriff was a man who believed in leaving things be, and he knew better than to march up that ridge with questions. His father had once told him, "Some homes ain't meant for your eyes." He took that to heart. The baby, from what little anyone saw, was pale and quiet. Too quiet. It rarely cried, and when it did, the sound was thin and weak, almost as if it lacked the strength for tears. The mother kept it swaddled tightly, shielding its face from view. Those who caught a glimpse swore its features mirrored the family's in a way that was unsettling, like seeing the same face repeat over generations until it lost all trace of the new. The girl herself became a shadow. She no longer came to Sue. Hirsch no longer stood on the porch in the evenings. The brother took over most of the outside chores, and when people passed on the road, he would stare them down until they looked away. It was around this time that an old-timer in town finally broke his own silence. Over a drink, he said he'd seen this before, in another family decades earlier. He called it blood folding in on itself. And when that happens, he warned, the sins don't wash away. They stay in the land, in the walls, in the people, and they find their way into the next generation, no matter how much you try to bury them. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The older folks in town didn't see this as a sudden tragedy. To them, it was simply the latest chapter in a story that had been quietly unfolding for decades. The family's land, high up on the ridge, had been theirs since before the Civil War, and for as long as anyone could remember, they married their own. Sometimes it was cousins, sometimes it was closer. No one ever left. The mountains were both their shelter and their prison. Isolation breeds its own kind of law. Without the mix of outsiders, the bloodline circles in on itself. You see it in the walk, limbs not quite straight. You hear it in the speech, words that take a strange shape in the mouth, and sometimes you see it in the mind, a certain dullness or worse, a strange, unpredictable temper. The family on the ridge had all three. The brother was known for his temper. People told stories about him snapping a chicken's neck in front of children or chasing a stranger off their property with a hatchet. His father encouraged it. Fear kept people away, and that's what the family wanted. But inside those walls, fear served another purpose. It kept the girl from speaking, from running, from seeking help. By the time the baby was a few months old, the brother acted like it was his. Not in the way a father does, but in a possessive, almost jealous way. If someone looked too long, his eyes would darken. He wouldn't let the girl carry the child into town, claiming it wasn't well enough to be out. But those who had seen it whispered that its frailty was more than illness. It was the mark of blood turned back on itself. And then there were the stories from before the girl was even born. About another child, a half-sibling who'd died young, about a stillborn baby buried without a cough. Finn, just a few yards from the back porch. Some even claimed there was a reason the family's grave markers bore no names, only stones, because too many of those names would have been the same. The preacher prayed over it in silence. The sheriff ignored it. And the town? The town simply looked the other way. Because in the mountains there's an understanding. If you dig too deep into another family's business, you might just uncover something that changes the way you see your own. By summer, the girl had all but vanished. Some said she'd taken to her bed, too weak to rise. Others whispered that she wasn't allowed to leave the cabin at all, not even to fetch water from the spring. Whatever the truth, no one saw her anymore. Only the brother was visible, moving through the fields with that slow, watchful gait of his, always keeping one eye toward the road, as though daring anyone to come closer. The child's cries were rarely heard now. A few times a neighbor walking the ridge road claimed to have caught a glimpse through the cabin window, just a pale shape in a cradle, unmoving. The same neighbor swore that in those moments the girl sat beside it, staring blankly into nothing, her lips moving as if speaking to someone who wasn't there. People began to say the baby wouldn't make it through the year. Inbreeding carries its own shadows, weak hearts, failing lungs, bodies that can't fight sickness. The midwife, still haunted by that night, avoided the ridge altogether, though she admitted privately that she expected to hear the church bell toll before winter. But here's the thing about this family. They didn't bury their dead like the rest of the town. No procession, no service, no marked grave. If the child passed, it would be laid into the earth somewhere on that property, under a mound of unmarked dirt, lost to the world outside. That was their way. It had been for generations. The girl's own health began to falter. An older woman who'd once been friendly with her mother claimed she'd seen her briefly on the porch one dawn, thin as a wisp, with bruises along her arms and collarbone. When she called out a greeting, the girl didn't answer. She just slipped back inside, the door closing soft but final. By then, the whispers were not just about the brother's sin, but about the father, about the way he seemed to keep both children, now adults, bound to that cabin like prisoners, and about his own place in the family's tangled bloodline. Some suspected the brother was not only the girl's sibling, but also something else. In a family where fathers were sometimes uncles and mothers sometimes cousins, it was hard to draw the lines clean. The ridge seemed quieter that summer, too quiet, and in these mountains, quiet is not peace. It's warning. Autumn came early that year. The leaves turned brittle and fell before their time, and the wind along the ridge seemed colder than it should have been. That's when people noticed that the brother had stopped coming into town altogether. The smoke from the cabin's chimney still rose each morning, thin and straight into the sky, but no one could say for sure who was inside. One hunter passing along a game trail near the property claimed he'd seen the girl out in the field just once. She was standing beside a small, fresh mound of dirt. No marker, no flowers, just turned earth. The hunter didn't speak to her. He knew better, but he swore she looked smaller than ever, almost hollowed out. As he told it, the way she held herself made him certain whatever was buried there was hers. After that, she disappeared again. Winter closed in, and the cabin became part of the landscape, just another shadow among the pines. No one knocked on the door. No one asked about the child. In this place, there is a line you do not cross, and the truth, once buried, is left to rot in the soil with the rest of the family's secrets. Years passed. The father died first. The brother took over the land. The girl was rarely seen, and when she was no longer a girl, but a woman with hair streaked grey, eyes sunk deep into her face. She never married, never left the ridge, and no one ever spoke the child's name, if it even had one. But there are still those in town who remember, old-timers who lower their voices when the family's name comes up, who glance toward the ridge before changing the subject. They speak of the way the bloodlines wound so tightly there that the past could never truly die. Some say you can feel it still, the weight of what happened, in the silence of the trees, in the stillness of the air. And if you go walking near that ridge on certain nights, you might hear it, the faint cry of a baby carried on the wind. Or maybe it's just the wind itself, bending through the holler in a way that makes you remember the story you were never supposed to know. The girl's name is gone from any record, but her story, it still lingers here like the taste of iron in well water. A reminder that in the deepest parts of these mountains, blood can be both the bond that holds a family together and the poison that destroys it.